Witchy Woo!
Hello, my lovelies, and welcome back to the Witchy Woo Podcast. So this is actually take 3 for me. The first time I recorded the podcast, but I did not plug in the microphone. The second time I started again by saying, this is take 2 because, and then explained what I had just done, and then had a panic that, have I plugged it in this time? So we are on take 3. So hopefully the third time lucky, and it's going to be an amazing episode, and it's going to have little gems that it wouldn't have had the first time, hopefully. So today I want to talk to you about something that comes up all the time, and I mean like literally all the time in the work that I do. So whether it's that I'm working with a one-to-one client, whether I'm working in the Akashic Records, whether I am casting spells for my beautiful clients, or it just comes up in conversation, there is always someone who says things like, I'm still really new to all of this, or I'm only a beginner, or I'm nowhere near as spiritual or as witchy as you are. And quite often, the woman saying this to me has been pulling tarot or oracle cards for years. She notices signs as she walks into the room. She immediately picks up on energy. She knows when something feels off. She may have crystals in her home. She may have had experiences where she hasn't trusted her gut and something has gone wrong, or she has trusted it and everything has gone right, and she has been leaning into her intuition for most of her life. But apparently she's still a beginner. And I always want to ask, when people say this to me, I always want to ask, so when exactly are you planning to graduate? You know, when are you going to pass this imaginary spirituality test that we seem to put in place for ourselves? Because it's often like we are waiting for someone to come along to tell us we have officially completed this now. We are no longer a beginner. We are now full on pledged spiritual goddess. And obviously it just doesn't happen. And this doesn't just happen in this area of life. I think it happens in all areas of life where we're almost waiting for the point that we feel as though we're ready, or we wait for the point where someone else recognizes that strength within us, and then it's okay for us to recognize that. But I think that there's something really interesting that goes on underneath this conversation, because I see women constantly moving the goalposts of their own spiritual development. So maybe when you first started exploring your own spirituality, maybe you started pulling tarot or oracle cards, and when you understood the message, it felt huge. You may have pulled a card. Maybe at the start you may have read the guidebook and you looked at what was happening in your life and you thought, oh my God, this is amazing. This makes so much sense for me. And then when you do that over and over again and it becomes part of your routine, eventually it just feels normal. So it stops counting as part of your spiritual development because it's just part of your everyday. And perhaps you come to a point where you start noticing your intuition more. You think about someone and your phone rings and it's them. Or you have a really strong gut feeling, and then later on you found out you were spot on with what you were thinking. And at first you'll think to yourself, when these experiences start happening, bloody hell, I'm actually all right at this. You'll notice it every time because it will be like a wow moment. But then again, when it happens enough times, it becomes part of your everyday. It becomes normal. And so again, it stops counting towards your spiritual development. So I think all of these things become part of our normal life. So you stop seeing them as much as you used to. And so you don't notice your spiritual development developing more. And instead you can look at someone else who is external from you, who you haven't seen go through those moments of doubt, who you don't know the whole story for, but you see things like they see spirit, they can read auras, they can open channels, they can look at an astrological birth chart and know exactly what all of the lines mean. They are walking a priestess path, they are connected strongly with the goddesses, they may know what every single crystal can do for you, what spiritual properties it has. And because you don't know that thing, you automatically place them above you. You make this hierarchy of who is more spiritual or more witchy. And I really want us to look at that today, because I think we're absolutely terrible at seeing our own progress when we're living inside it. And it reminds me of our children growing up. When you see them every single day, you don't notice those small changes that are happening every day. But then someone who hasn't seen them for like 6 months walks in, it's like, oh my God, look how much you've grown. And you might look at them and think, yeah, actually, when did you get this big? When did you grow up? Because you're living in that moment day to day. You're not recognizing it. Like my son, who's 11 years old, is now as tall as me. And in my mind, but he's my baby. I still think of him as that 6-pound baby that I gave birth to. And I haven't noticed him grow. It's only in those moments where I really think about it and think, wow, look how big you've got. Look how much you've grown. And I would say the same for my daughter as well, bless her. But she does take after her mummy in the height department. And so at nearly 18, she hasn't grown for quite a few years, and I don't think she's going to. But again, I still see her as that 4-pound baby that I had, you know, because we don't see the changes every day. And it's exactly the same with your spiritual growth. You don't notice the growth that you're having every single day, because most of the time your spiritual journey isn't made up of massive wow moments. You may get them occasionally, but usually it is made up of the small moments where you're developing and you're growing at a slower race, but it is still going up and going up. And as I kind of touched on, when it's yourself, you know every single doubt that you have had about your spiritual side. You know every single meditation that hasn't gone right. And that is a complete different subject on its own. I don't believe that any experience of meditation or Akashic journey or anything that you do can go wrong. I think it always goes as it's meant to, but that is a whole other episode on its own. But you know every moment where you've pulled a card and you've thought, I don't have a bloody clue what this could be for me. I can't see it. You know every time that you haven't trusted your gut. So you don't see that in someone else. You are seeing this completed version where they have perhaps given an amazing reading to someone, where they have shown you a picture of their gorgeous altar, where they are talking confidently about speaking to their guides and about the messages that they've received. But you don't see them sitting there 5 minutes earlier wondering whether the download was actually intuition or whether she just had a thought, whether it came from inside of them. And I think social media has made this so much worse, because we now have access to everyone else's spiritual practices in a way that we never did before. So you can only open Instagram at 8 o'clock in the morning, and apparently someone has already meditated, journaled, pulled 12 cards, spoken to their ancestors, drunk ceremonial cacao, and done breath work, Meanwhile, you're there having just yelled, "Where are your shoes?" to the kids after you've been telling them for an hour to get ready. But does that mean that they are more spiritual than you? Absolutely not. It means that you are looking at one tiny little window in someone else's life and comparing it with the entirety of your own life, of your own experience. And I also think that we've accidentally created a hierarchy around spiritual gifts where some things seem to count more than others. So I often see this within the clairsensors. When I start working with someone, I will give them, if they haven't had an experience before of meditation or spirituality, I will give them a little exercise to do. And in this exercise, it's really quick and easy to find out which of your clairsenses are most open at the moment. And if you would like that really quick exercise, let me know and I will happily send it over to you. Just reach out to me, Kylie Anna on Facebook, or Kylie@witchywoo.net via email. But anyway, so I will give them this little short exercise. And I guarantee you 99% of the people that I work with favor seeing things, favor clairvoyance, because I think it has been almost drummed into us that if we see it, it makes it more real. I actually put a post out on Facebook. Well, I put a couple out in the past week. So this is going out on the 11th, I think, of August of 2026. So obviously it will depend on when you're listening to this, but about how I believe, or I don't believe, I should say, that seeing is believing. I believe believing is seeing. Because if we don't have that belief there first, then seemingly ordinary events are just that. They're just ordinary. If we have the belief there of magic and spirit, we can see the synchronicities behind it. We can see the hidden messages. But now I'm just allowing my mind to go off on all different tangents. So what I was actually saying was seeing things seems to be high on the priority, high on the hierarchy. And I work with so many women who say, I'm not psychic because I can't see anything. But I'll say, okay, here's the clairsenses task. Tell me what you experience. So many of the women that work with me feel things, or they just know things. They have that inner knowing, they have that inner feeling. But for some reason, they discount it, or it's not as good as seeing things. But they can feel people's energy. They just know things. They don't know where they got the information from, but they just know the things. They can tell when someone's saying they're fine, but they're absolutely not. They get gut feelings about people. They will be able to pick out the rotten apple, so to speak, in milliseconds when everyone else may fall for their charm. They know when something isn't right, even when they can't explain why. But because they don't close their eyes and see their spirit guide standing there, apparently that doesn't count. And this is something that I really want you to hear if you've ever thought that you weren't very intuitive or you weren't very spiritual because you don't see things. Seeing is just one way of receiving information, and it isn't the gold standard. Some people see, some people hear, some people feel, some people know, some people receive messages through their dreams, some people notice synchronicities and patterns, some people experience things through their body, through their feelings, some people have a mixture of everything. And some people probably couldn't tell you how they know something if you paid them, but they do know it. And actually, those can be some of the most intuitive people that I have met, because their intuition has become so natural to them that they don't even recognize it as intuition anymore. It almost feels like common sense. They call it instinct, reading people, knowing their children. Just, if you say things like, I just had a feeling, and then they carry on with their day. Which brings me to the other group of women who I really want to talk about in this episode, because perhaps you've been listening to everything I've said and thinking, well, none of this really applies to me because I wouldn't even call myself spiritual in the first place. Maybe you don't own tarot cards, or you don't meditate. You've never opened the Akashic records, and maybe the word witch does not resonate with you in the slightest. And if someone introduced you as one, you'd probably look behind you to see who it was that they were actually talking about. And that's okay. That's completely fine. If you are listening to this and you are here right now, I love that you are here. Firstly, trust that you are here for a reason. And I have absolutely no interest in telling anyone what they should call themselves. But I do want to ask you something. Are you absolutely sure you're as disconnected from all of this as you think you are? Because spirituality doesn't always look the same. Sometimes it can be things like, I knew there was something off about that person. I walked into that room and the atmosphere just felt horrible. I don't know why, but I really need to go outside today. I thought about her this morning and then she called me. I just knew I shouldn't go. I can always tell when my child isn't okay. I feel so much better when I'm near the sea. I don't know what it is about that house, but I just don't like it. I knew that was going to happen. Notice if you recognize yourself in any of those statements, because if you've been saying things like that for your entire life without ever considering them remotely spiritual, perhaps what you call being good at reading people is actually something you've been developing for decades. Perhaps what you call gut instincts is one of the strongest forms of guidance that you have. And perhaps the reason that you feel like a completely different human after walking through the woods isn't something that you need to analyze or label at all. Perhaps you simply have a relationship with nature that brings you back to yourself. And I think that's where this conversation gets really interesting, because what if you're not at the beginning at all? What if you just never counted everything that came before you decided to start paying attention to spirituality? Because your spiritual journey didn't necessarily begin at the point where you bought your first tarot book or noticed that you wanted to get into spirituality. You saw a sparkly crystal and just knew that you had to have it. Maybe you've been listening to something from inside of you for a lot longer than that. And I think that we have some really narrow ideas sometimes of what a spiritual person looks like. And I suppose this is particularly interesting coming from me because I very openly call myself a witch. I'm literally sat here with my witch's hat, with all my crystals on, and I know I use cards, I cast spells, I open the Akashic records, I work with energy, I do all of these things that you would probably quite easily put into the spiritual or witchy box. But I don't think you need to do any of those things to have a really strong connection to yourself, your intuition, energy, nature, or whatever you personally believe exists beyond what we can physically see. And for me, that at its core, at its heart, is what being a witch or being spiritual actually means. Connection with yourself, connection with nature, connection with energy and the people around you. It is connection. And some of the most intuitive women I know wouldn't describe themselves as spiritual at all. They'd say to me, oh no, I'm not into all of that. And then 10 minutes later, they'd be telling me that they knew from the moment that they met someone that they couldn't trust them, even though everyone else thought that they were lovely. Or they'll immediately tell me that they'd walk into a room and immediately know people have been arguing, or that they always seem to know when their child is going to call them because they suddenly can't stop thinking about them. And I'll be sitting there thinking, okay, then, because what do you think you're doing? You might call it reading energy, but if someone walks into a room and you immediately sense that something has changed before they've said a word, you're picking something up. Now, of course, there can be a really ordinary things involved in that too. We're constantly noticing body language, facial expressions, tone, all loads of these tiny little things that we wouldn't consciously take in, but subconsciously we are reading those signs. And I'm not suggesting that every time you know your husband's in a mood with you, you've suddenly become Mystic Meg. Sometimes he's just stomping around the kitchen and putting mugs down a bit too hard, and he's letting you know. He is communicating that with you. But I also think we've become really good at explaining away every single thing that we experience because somewhere along the line, we've decided that intuition has to feel spectacular before we're allowed to trust it. And most of the time, it really doesn't. Sometimes intuition can be so boring. Sometimes it's just that little feeling of, no, I don't think I want to do that. Sometimes you meet someone and there's nothing you can actually put your finger on, but something pulls back in you. Sometimes you're about to send an email and something tells you to read it one more time, and you spot the massive mistake that you made, that you somehow missed the first 4 times that you reread it. And sometimes you suddenly think about someone that you haven't spoken to for months, and later that day, their name pops up on your phone. If you look back over your whole life, I wonder how many times you have just said, I knew it. Because that's the bit that we forget. We don't necessarily remember all the times that our intuition has quietly nudged us in the right direction, but we do remember the times we ignored it. How many times have you got involved with someone and thought afterwards, I knew there was something up with them? How many times have you agreed to something when every single part of you has said no, only to end up regretting it later on? How many times have you talked yourself out of something you knew because you couldn't explain it logically enough to justify it to someone else? And this is where I think we need to stop measuring intuition by how dramatic the experience is. You don't need to hear some booming voice from the heavens saying, do not go to Tesco today. Although, how much easier would it be if our guides did do that? But, I would kind of appreciate that. But unfortunately, things don't work like that. And for a lot of people, intuition is subtle because they've been living with it for so long that it's been woven into the way that they naturally move through the world. And nature is another massive one. I think sometimes we hear the phrase connection with nature and immediately imagine someone barefoot in a forest hugging an oak tree while communicating with the fairies, which I must say I love. I am in love with that. And if you love doing that, you are my people. But connection to nature can be so much simpler than that. It might be that you've always loved the seaside. Maybe when everything feels too much, you need to get outside. Maybe you have a favorite tree on a walk that you do regularly, and maybe you've never even told anyone that that's your favorite tree because it sounds a bit weird, but you know the one that I mean as I'm saying this to you. Maybe you love thunderstorms. I personally am a storm witch, so I adore thunderstorms. And maybe the first properly warm day of spring does something to your whole mood, lifts you. None of these things require a spiritual label. And I'm certainly not going to tell you that loving a walk in the woods automatically makes you a witch. But what I am saying is that connection doesn't suddenly become valid because we give it spiritual language. You don't have to know that rosemary is associated with protection before you can love growing rosemary. You don't have to understand grounding as an energetic practice to know that going outside when your head feels full makes you feel better. You don't have to celebrate every Sabbath to notice that the seasons are changing and feel your own energy changing with them. You don't have to call the moon Grandmother Moon and charge 17 jars of moon water every month to have looked up at the full moon and felt something. And you definitely don't have to call yourself a witch. I want to make that really clear because I love that word and it means a lot to me. I chose it for myself, but that doesn't mean that every intuitive or spiritually connected woman has to want it as well. You get to choose your own language. You might call yourself spiritual. You might call yourself intuitive or say that you're empathic. You might simply say you're very good at reading people, or you may not label it at all because the label isn't the important part of it. The relationship to yourself is the important part. And I think that's where we can start missing our own progress because we're looking for the external markers of what we think spirituality should look like rather than noticing what's actually changing inside of us. And I've worked with so many women who say to me that I don't think my intuition has developed very much. And then they'll casually tell me that 2 years ago, they would have asked 5 different people what they should do about something, whereas now they almost immediately know what feels right for them. That is a huge development, a huge achievement that deserves celebrating. They may tell me that they don't get any signs anymore, but actually, when we talk about it, what they mean is that they don't need as many signs anymore because they're starting to trust themselves, or simply they're not looking for the signs. Maybe you used to pull, 6 cards a day because you didn't believe the first one. Now you pull one and think, yeah, I know what that's talking about. And this is another biggie. Maybe you used to think that meditation was completely emptying your mind and sitting perfectly still for 45 minutes. And now you've realized that 10 minutes of sitting quietly in the garden can give you exactly what you need. Maybe you used to believe that spirituality was something external from you. It existed outside of you and you had to learn how to access this thing. Whereas now you're beginning to realize that so much of it is actually about learning how to hear yourself underneath all of this noise that we experience every single day. And that's progress. And the annoying thing about progress is that once something becomes normal, we very quickly forget that it was ever difficult for us. It's like when you first drive a car, there's so much to remember. I remember the panic, the mirrors, the gears, the clutch, the indicators, where everybody else on the road was. And somehow you're also supposed to listen to the person who's sitting beside you, telling you exactly what to do. But eventually, you just drive. You don't get home and congratulate yourself for successfully changing gears 73 times on the way home because it just becomes automatic. And I think we do exactly the same thing spiritually. The thing you once desperately wanted to be able to do becomes something that you do so naturally. And instead of recognizing that as evidence of how far you've come, you immediately look for the next thing that you can't do. And that's why I think asking, am I spiritual enough, is such a pointless question. Because enough compared to who? The woman on Instagram, or your teacher, or your friend who sees spirit, someone who's been practicing for 30 odd years. None of us have your exact set or combination of experiences, of gifts, of beliefs, and of connection. So perhaps a better question is, what can I recognize in myself today that I couldn't recognize a year ago? And if you're someone who doesn't identify as spiritual at all, maybe your question is even simpler. What have I always known about myself that I've never really given myself credit for? Because I have a feeling that if you actually sat down and took stock of your life rather than only counting the things that look obviously spiritual from the outside, you'd find a hell of a lot more experience than you'd expect. And I think there's a reason that so many women struggle to claim that knowing, to say, actually, yes, I am intuitive. I do trust myself. I do know things. I have developed. I'm good at this. Because claiming what we know and trusting ourselves hasn't always been encouraged in women. And that's where the witch wound comes back into this conversation, because I think there's something much deeper going on underneath all of that innocent little phrase, oh, I'm only a beginner. And I think this is where we need to bring the witch wound into the conversation, because when a woman tells me she's only a beginner, sometimes she genuinely is at the beginning of exploring a particular practice. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. We're all beginners at some point, and there will be so much to learn. We will always have so much to learn, because it seems like there's this infinite amount, and that's gorgeous. I've been doing this work for years, and there's so much that I know nothing about, because being experienced doesn't suddenly make you like this encyclopedia for everything spiritual. But there's a difference between being new to something and continually making yourself new to something. There's a difference between saying, I've only started learning tarot, which might be completely true, and saying, I'm only a beginner spiritually. When you've spent the last 10 years developing a relationship with your intuition, with your healing, question what you were taught when you were growing up, exploring different practices, and becoming increasingly confident in what feels right for you. And I think sometimes the word beginner becomes a really safe space for us to hide. Because if I'm a beginner, nobody expects me to know anything. If I'm a beginner, I don't have to trust what I receive. If I'm a beginner, I can ask someone else before I make the decision. If I'm a beginner, I don't have to say, actually, I know this. And perhaps even more importantly, if I'm a beginner, no one can really challenge me, because I've already put myself at the bottom of this, imaginary hierarchy before anyone else gets the chance to. And when you look at that through the lens of the witch wound, I think it becomes really interesting, because throughout this entire season, we've been talking about all these different ways that women learn to stay safe. We've talked about staying small, about carrying everyone else's shit, about being frightened of our own intuition and our own potential, being told we're too sensitive, trying to fit into boxes that were never made for us. And all of these things may look completely different on the surface, but underneath, so many of them ask the same question. Is it safe for me to be fully who I am? And I think we can add another question to that today. Is it safe for me to trust what I know? Because women trusting what they know hasn't always been welcomed. Women who knew their bodies, women who understood herbs, women who worked with birth and death, women who had knowledge that existed outside of those accepted institutions, women who questioned authority, women who passed knowledge between themselves, women whose wisdom couldn't necessarily be explained or be controlled. We know from the historical stories that we've explored throughout this season that being perceived as different, troublesome, knowledgeable, outspoken, wise could make a woman really vulnerable. And I'm not suggesting that every time you question a tarot reading, it's because someone in 1612 got accused of witchcraft. Obviously, I'm not. But I do think there's a much bigger cultural history around women being encouraged to doubt themselves, to defer to somebody who supposedly knows better, to seek permission and be very careful about claiming authority on something. And I think that can still show up in our spiritual lives in really subtle ways. You receive an intuitive message, but before you trust it, you'll ask someone else what they think. You pull a card, know immediately what it means for you, but then run to the guidebook so that it can confirm your inner knowing. And I want to be really clear here, because I am a spiritual teacher. I give readings. I teach people how to access the Akashic records. I do spell work. I love learning from other people myself. And I hope I never reach the point where I think I know everything, because that sounds bloody awful. There is so much value in teachers, in mentors, in books, in readings, in courses, in communities, and all the different ways that we can learn from one another. But I believe a good spiritual teacher should ultimately help you to trust yourself more. If working with someone makes you feel as though they have all the answers and you have none, I think that's worth paying attention to. Because the goal shouldn't be to become so reliant on someone else that you stop listening to your own intuition. And maybe that is another form of spiritual development that we don't celebrate enough, because you used to need a reading every time something happened in your life. And now sometimes you sit quietly and you ask yourself instead. Perhaps you used to pull cards every day because you needed reassurance about what was coming, whereas now you pull them because you enjoy having that conversation. And all of this is growth. It might not be flashy, and no one's going to make a TikTok about the exciting moment they stopped asking everyone else's opinions quite so much. But I would argue that becoming more sovereign in your own spiritual practice is one of the biggest signs of spiritual development that there is. And if you're listening to this as someone who doesn't refer to themselves as spiritual, the same thing applies for you. Maybe you've never pulled a tarot card in your life, but you're much better at listening to yourself than you were 5 years ago. Maybe you learn when your body says no, you need to pay attention. Maybe you've stopped forcing yourself to stay around people who leave you feeling like shit. Maybe you know you need time outside when life gets too loud. Maybe you've started noticing patterns in your own life, or perhaps you're better at recognizing when you're taking on everyone else's emotions. Maybe you trust that little feeling in your stomach now instead of immediately talking yourself out of it. You can call it intuition or energetic awareness or emotional intelligence, experience, instinct, or simply knowing yourself really, really well. And I don't really care what you call it. I care that you recognize it, because I think that's the bit that so many women miss. We're so busy looking for that next level that we don't turn around and look at the bloody mountain we've already climbed. And I want you to do something after this episode. I don't want you to overthink it or turn it into spiritual homework where you need a spiritual journal and the perfect candle and 45 minutes of uninterrupted silence. Just think about who you were, where you were a year ago. And If a year doesn't feel like long enough, go back 3 years, 5 years, 10 years even. What did that woman believe about herself? What did she need reassurance about? What did she ignore? What frightened her? What did she think spirituality had to look like? What did she think intuition was supposed to feel like? What decisions did she struggle to make without asking everyone else first? Because that is your evidence. Maybe today you can pull a card and you can trust the message that comes through to you first. Maybe you can feel energy in a way that you couldn't before. Maybe you understand your own womanly cycles better. Maybe you've learned how to protect your energy or developed a relationship with your guide, your ancestors, the Akashic records, the moon, the land. Maybe you're practicing witchcraft openly when a few years ago you wouldn't even said the word witch out loud. Or maybe none of that applies to you, but you've learned to listen to something that feels wrong. You've become more comfortable with your own company. You notice you need to get outside and put your feet on the grass. You understand yourself more deeply, and you're finally beginning to trust that you don't always need to have a logical explanation for every single thing that you feel. Please don't dismiss that because somebody else can do something that you can't yet. And please stop taking the things that you've already learned and putting them into a box labeled, well, that doesn't count because I can do it now. Of course it bloody counts. The fact that something feels easy now might be the biggest evidence that you have of your spiritual growth. And think about the thing that you currently look at that somebody else is doing and think, God, I wish I could do that. Maybe it's mediumship or reading tarot intuitively or connecting with the Akashic records, casting spells, whatever it is. Imagine the version of you 5 years from now looking at you today. What would she think? Because I have a feeling there are things about your life now that she once desperately wanted. There are things that you do now without even thinking about it that she would have found extraordinary. There are things that you know that she was still trying to understand, and parts of yourself that you've accepted that she was still hiding. And yet here you are, looking ahead at somebody further down a completely different path and using them as evidence that you're somehow behind. You're not behind. There isn't a queue. There isn't one spiritual path with everyone standing in order, waiting to reach this enlightenment phase where someone stamps their loyalty card. We're all experiencing things. We're all learning different things, developing different gifts, and moving through different seasons of our lives. And perhaps somebody is looking at you right now and thinking, God, I wish I had trusted my intuition like she does. So the next time that you hear yourself saying, I'm only a beginner, I want you to catch yourself, because I want you to ask whether that is actually true. A beginner at what? Because you might be a beginner at tarot and incredibly experienced at reading energy. You might know absolutely nothing about astrology, but have spent 40 years instinctively working with plants and the seasons. You may have never meditated for a day in your life, but have incredible relationship with your own intuition. Because maybe the reason you can't see how spiritual you are, how intuitive you are, or how far you've come isn't because there isn't anything to see. Maybe you've just been standing inside your own progress for so long that it looks completely ordinary from where you're standing right now. And I think that's what I want you to take away from today's episode, to stop measuring your beginning against somebody else's middle. Stop assuming that the loudest spiritual gifts are the goalposts. And every time you reach them, give yourself credit for the woman that you have already become. You don't have to see spirit in order to be intuitive, and you don't have to call yourself a witch in order to have a relationship with nature. Maybe you're further along than you think. Maybe you've been doing this for far longer than you realize. And maybe rather than asking yourself what you still need to learn, today you could turn around for a moment and look at everything you've already learned along the way, because I bet it's a hell of a lot. So thank you for joining me for another episode of the Witchy Woo Podcast. As always, if you've been listening to this thinking, oh my God, she's talking about me, come and let me know. I would love, love, love to hear from you. You can reach out to me on Facebook, Kylie Anna. You can email me, kylie@witchywoo.net. I would so love to hear from you. And maybe send this episode to a woman in your life who insists that she's not spiritual at all, despite knowing exactly who's ringing before she picks up her phone, reading everyone's energy within 30 seconds of meeting them, and owning, 17 houseplants that she talks to every morning. You know the one I mean. So until the next time, my lovelies, keep trusting yourself, keep questioning the shoulds, and let's continue to sod those shoulds and embrace spiritual freedom. I'll speak to you soon.
Witchy Woo!